Well, as it turns out, it has to do with efficiency, and in particular, efficiency of something called scale, which basically is a fancy word for size, right? So the size of the business determines how efficient it is. Okay, so what this does is it splits the long-run average cost curve into three different parts. There's the part where as it gets bigger, right, as its scale goes up, it becomes more economical. It becomes more efficient. Okay, so this is where the U-shaped curve is declining, right? Costs are getting lower as the firm gets bigger. So that's called economies of scale. Then there's the part right at the minimum, or if it's flat at the bottom, it also means the flat part, where we refer to this part as constant returns to scale, and that's because costs are not changing as the firm gets bigger, if it's flat or if it's at its minimum. And then there's the part of the long-run average cost curve that's going up, and we refer to that as diseconomies of scale, because as the firm gets bigger, things get less economical, things get less efficient, costs start to go up. Okay, so again, economies of scale, this is where the firm is experiencing decreases in its long-run average costs resulting from increasing its output. Now, of course, these economies of scale don't persist indefinitely. And once the long-run average costs begin to rise, the cost curve begins to slope upward, and we no longer have economies of scale. Now, what are some different reasons for economies of scale? So one of them actually turns out to be very similar to what we had in the short run. Teams can specialize, right? There can be a division of tasks or operations that allow the firm to sort of become more efficient. There's also this dimensional factor. So large-scale firms usually often require less output proportionally with respect to the input per unit of output. So another source of efficiency, basically. And then the last one is simply improved productive equipment. So usually larger companies have more resources, and so they can take advantage of large volume bulk production, right? As opposed to smaller firms can't take advantage of sort of mass production, right? Okay, so graphically, again, this is what the different types of scale look like. So here we've got economies of scale, where costs are coming down as output increases. Here we have constant returns to scale, where the cost is staying the same or constant as output increases. And then here we have diseconomies of scale, because things are getting more expensive as the firm increases output. Now, why might a firm experience diseconomies of scale? Well, there are limits to the efficient functioning of management, right? So management is this weird thing because managers don't actually produce anything, right? They manage people that produce. And so at first, right, there's some efficiency gains from management, but there are limitations to this. And eventually it kind of can become a drag on the economy if there's more and more management. In addition to that, coordination and communication can become more challenging as the firm gets bigger, right? It becomes harder to manage and harder. The communication between departments and different parts of the firm can become more complex and therefore more costly. Okay, so let's think about an international policy example. A government produces solar energy on a massive scale to pump more oil. That's kind of interesting, right? So there's this government, the government of Oman in the Middle East, and it is one of the leading it has one of the world's largest solar energy facilities. Now, the facility produces steam created by the sun heating up water, which in turn is injected into underground oil fields and that allows them to extract oil from these oil fields. Now, this method results in a reduction in long-run average cost of oil extraction only if the facility pumps oil in sufficiently large volumes, meaning that the cost savings payoff occurs through economies of scale. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense for them to do this, right? So talking about the mass production, the bulk production, right? Pretty interesting. Okay, something else you need to be aware of when we're talking about long-run average cost curves is something called minimum efficient scale. Now, this is the lowest rate of output. What's the smallest amount of output that the firm can produce in order to minimize its cost? So basically, let's see if we've got a picture here. Yep, we do. So here's an average, long-run average cost curve. Right here we have economies of scale. Between A and B, we have constant returns to scale, and then here we have diseconomies of scale. Now, all along this point between A and B, costs are minimized, and the smallest amount of output to get to that minimum cost is 10 units in this example. Okay, so in this case, 10 is the minimum efficient scale. It's the minimum amount of output required in order to minimize cost. Okay, so that's what minimum efficient scale is. So if you've got an average, long-run average cost curve here, it's just find the minimum and then find the point along the minimum that's furthest to the left. That's where minimum efficient scale is. Now, how can we relate these to different size industries? So if the industry has a small minimum efficient scale relative to its industry demand, what that means is that there's a room for a lot of small but efficient firms, and it leads to a high degree of competition because there's so many efficient firms. Now, contrast that with an industry that has large minimum efficient scale relative to industry demand. It means that there's room for only a small number of efficient firms, and so there will be a small degree of competition. All right, let's look at another example as we begin to wrap up this chapter. Tesla's initial home battery production scale is below the minimum efficient scale. So Tesla has developed batteries, the company Tesla, not the scientist. Tesla has developed batteries that can store electricity that come from solar panels placed on the home's walls or roofs in order to store it for use at night when there's no sun out. Now, so far, interest in the company's home battery systems supports the production of several hundred batteries per month. But in order to maintain production at a minimum efficient scale, Tesla would have to produce thousands of these batteries per month. So the demand for these batteries is not sufficient to get it to the point where it can minimize its cost of production.